All right, everyone, we'll start. It's a couple of minutes after the hour. We'll start. I don't know if anyone attended the lecture by Ambassador Rice just a couple of hours ago, but there was a great part of that where she said something like the opportunity to work in government service is some of the most rewarding and satisfying and important work you'll do. And I was warmed to hear that. And I bring that up because our research seminar presenter today does that for a living. Mahima Sikand is an Indian Foreign Service officer, that is to say, a serving Indian diplomat, and is here at Stanford for essentially a sabbatical year, for an academic year, where she has undertaken a really important piece of work. The piece of work she has undertaken, I think, is useful because it's current, but it's also very relevant to the Indian government and indeed to other state governments around the world, because it's about how we can approach the problem, the challenge of global governance in artificial intelligence. I will throw it open to Mahima, and as always, she will speak for about 35 minutes, give or take, and then I will moderate the Q&A. And so without further ado, over to you, Mahima.
Thanks, Erzan. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. And thank you, Erzan, for all your guidance and advice for the project as I've worked through this over the past few months. So as Erzan has already introduced the topic, the focus of my research is basically to identify some clear, practical, and implementable strategies that India could deploy in its diplomatic endeavors towards establishing sovereign AI capabilities, which I believe, after having studied a lot of strategy documents that have come out of India, is the core foundational ethos of India's strategy and approaches. So to start with, let's spend a minute on understanding what sovereign AI really is and why it matters. So sovereign AI can be regarded as an offshoot of digital sovereignty, and it's basically the capacity of a country to control AI development, deployment, end users, and all of the supply chain constraints that go along with the life cycle from top to bottom. So basically have sovereign control over how AI is both developed and used. And today about 75 countries, give or take, have issued strategy documents on AI that refer to either national or sovereign AI capability aspirations. This is what the CEO of NVIDIA has called the second wave of AI, which the first one was obviously the private sector-led advancements and developments. But this wave of state engagement with AI is what he's called the second wave of sovereign AI. And why it matters? It matters primarily because of three reasons: because of the transformational impact of the technology itself for both social, economic, development of countries; because of how it will determine the geotech competition that's become a big input into geopolitics in general, and it will also sort of entrench a country's place in a technology value chain, giving it significant leverages in diplomatic and multilateral work. And thirdly, because of national security considerations, because as much as AI holds the promise for social and economic development, there's also a very strong risk of military integration and how that could impact security considerations of states. For this sort of project, my research outline and methodology, I'll quickly summarize in 2 minutes because I've done a bunch of things. So to kind of take you through the process, the goal is, like I said, to identify strategies to secure sovereign AI through international cooperation. How I've done that is, first, I've done a pretty detailed study of the AI landscape. What I mean by that is the supply chain issues, life cycle, how AI is developed, what it's used for, and also what is the current conversations on governance, both at national and international platforms. I've also looked at the geopolitical context in which AI development and competition is taking place. Then I go to the nuclear proliferation treaty architecture and study the process of how it was set up. I distill insights and draw broad lessons from the NPT story. Then I synthesize that into the context of AI governance and Indian interests. So question on why did I choose the NPT? as a model to do this project. There are three primary reasons why I decided to look at the NPT to help guide my research. Primarily, I was taken by the similarities in the technologies. So both nuclear and AI are general purpose, dual use technologies. They can be fashioned towards the military applications, civilian applications, and they both also developed or are developing in the case of AI amidst significant geopolitical competition. Secondly, the NPT, despite significant critiques, which I will get into in my project on the structural inequities, has done fairly well in sort of meeting the objectives of non-proliferation and peaceful transfer of nuclear energy. And thirdly, I think India's own unique experience with the NPT, where it decided to stay out of the regime, even though it very actively negotiated and participated in all the bargaining that led up to the NPT, allowed it to sort of preserve strategic space for it to develop its own weapons and secure its interests in a hostile neighborhood. That also it was mainstreamed eventually. And I think that has left an indelible mark on how Indian policymakers will engage with technology controls and technology governance. So now let's get into the AI landscape. Like, where can we scope for governance? What could be the potential points of governance? So this table demonstrates the AI supply chain and the AI life cycle. Let's look at the AI supply chain first. There are 4 critical choke points to develop and use this technology. One is compute power, which is basically your chips, your hardware, and the cloud computing services. Then you have AI talent, because it's a new technology. You need skilled workforce that could both develop and then use the technology. Data, of course, is the building block and the input that goes into all algorithmic decision making. And then you need physical infrastructure in way of like water and energy to maintain the data centers that are used for training and deploying models. In this case, this is where India holds some strengths and some weaknesses. So on talent, where India has a pretty large skilled workforce, of course, there are still gaps, but it's one of the strengths. And as a large producer of personal data, with more than like 500 million internet users today, India also has significant leverage in one of the basic inputs of the AI supply chain, which is data. On compute, which is both the hardware and the cloud computing services, there are significant vulnerabilities that India has. And similarly on physical infrastructure, which requires massive amounts of energy and water. For a developing country like India, that would mean significant diversion from already resource scarce community setup. So these are some vulnerabilities. For the AI life cycle, there are about 5 stages that go into the entire development and deployment of the model. The first stage is basically you're collecting data, you're training the data. Then you're somebody is selecting the data and curating it. You're training the data for whatever downstream application you want to intend it to be. You're then adapting it to that application and then deploying it. And here as well, from my understanding, India holds strengths as far as data creation is concerned. And then because of its skilled workforce and because of the large digital sort of penetration, it also has a pretty strong leverage on the adaptation and deployment stages by fine-tuning large foundational models that are available in open source. So I think from this table, one can also look at where exactly would India's interests in governing be. Where are the points that India would like to control, or where are the points where India would like a more lax regulatory environment? I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but this is also like a quick summary of what is the current AI governance set up around the world. And these are sort of the prime documents that have come out. So the EU, which has a very right-centric approach focused on risk-based categorization with outright banning the most high-risk models, and a focus on horizontal regulation across sectors. US and China, surprisingly, have a lot in common with their approaches. It's a loose regulatory approach to sort of drive innovation and maintain leadership. And there's also a very strong cooperation between the state and the private sector in both countries. But of course, The US has a more market-centric approach, whereas for China, it's more state-centric, and the focus is on content regulation and control that is not upsetting the political and social setup of the regime. And then there are many multiple processes going on in the multilateral space. Apart from like plurilateral bodies in the UN, also there is now a body that is looking at the governance proposal from various experts. And I think by this year, at the Future Summit of the Future in September 24 in the UN, there could be some kind of proposal or arrangement that comes out of the UN. So with this sort of established as the general AI playground that we're looking at, I now focus my next 5 minutes on what then we learn from the NPT. So for me, the NPT begins basically, the examination of the NPT begins with understanding what basically prompted calls for controls and regulations and governance. And you see that from the first proposal in 1946, which was made by the US under the Baruch Plan, where the US actually unilaterally did agree to destroy all its nuclear arsenal and transfer it to the under the care of the UN Atomic Agency. It was at that point disregarded by the Soviet Union because it did not have its own bomb. And from then on, basically, this story tells us how both superpowers, US and USSR, systematically vetoed and ensured that alternative proposals on which more comprehensively addressed nuclear risk and security that came from many non-nuclear weapon states and smaller powers in the system were ignored. I'll just spend a couple of minutes giving you a few examples. For example, in 1958, the Swedish foreign minister tabled a resolution called the Undone Resolution, under which it proposed nuclear-free weapon zones, which would have sort of looked at nuclear security through the prism of regional security, instead of just having a very narrow view on non-proliferation and non-dissemination, but no controls on non-use and disarmament. There was also a proposal that several states, including India, tabled in the 18-Nation Disarmament Committee, which was a General Assembly body comprising many states that were negotiating a nuclear technology governance regime, which called for basically 5 phased sort of approach to nuclear security. That was non-dissemination, non-use, non-acquisition, disarmament, and I think one more, which I'm not able to remember, but basically it had a sort of a broader lens. At that point, the US and USSR were engaged in an arms race in the 1950s, but there was also a congruence of interests where they decided that the expansion of the nuclear club and the very near nuclear latency of several countries in Asia and Europe, like China, Japan, Italy, Germany, that the potential for them going nuclear was a common threat to both the US and USSR, which saw that as sort of undermining the superpower status. And even though they were amenable to some extent for nuclear sharing with their allies, there was absolutely no appetite for that to spread further. And that is what eventually prompted the two countries to come together and, from about 1961, engage in bilateral discussions. They had a sort of 3-party agreement in 1963 between the US, UK, and USSR about the Limited Test Ban Treaty, which again put very severe constraints on any atmosphere and undersea testing by non-nuclear weapon states, whereas no such constraints were put on nuclear weapon states. The point here is basically, despite multiple proposals that more comprehensively addressed the issue of nuclear security, superpowers, by the nature of the system, made sure that those that impinged on any of their own capabilities, whether it was the ability to share with allies, which was a big point for the US, which really wanted to preserve the status of the multilateral nuclear force of NATO, or for the USSR, which did not sort of also have a similar interest in sharing with its own allies within the Warsaw Pact. I think that kind of pretty much meant that there was no space left for what we can call as emerging powers, the second-grade powers. And this, as soon as a bilateral agreement was reached between the US and USSR in 1966 on what was going to become the skeletal structure of the NPT, it was tabled to first the allies, then to the larger body of the ENDC, after which pretty much they were told there are no changes acceptable, that initial piece of document had only articles 1 to 3 about non-proliferation and safeguards. But given the complete absence of disarmament and the irritation amongst smaller powers on the potential that they would never be able to access nuclear technology, even for peaceful means, there was a lot of pushback, some very crucial and effective rhetorical and bargaining strategies were used by smaller powers, consolidating their bargaining position. And you finally got somewhat of an agreement on Article 4 on peaceful use of nuclear energy and Article 6 on disarmament, although without any enforcement mechanisms tied into the treaty. So what have we learned? Number one, superpowers are unlikely to submit to governance till there is a diffusion of capabilities amongst emerging powers. And that would become the primary motivating factor for when you can expect a technology governance regime to emerge, rather than any sort of conversation about safety and risks. The second lesson I draw here is that emerging powers have a very limited window of opportunity where there is lax regulation because it suits the interests of the major powers as well. And in that window, it is important they augment the sovereign capabilities and bargaining power. And here I would like to say that this is exactly what France and China did. As the negotiations were going on, they were close to having their own weapons. They opted out of the negotiations on the NPT. But by the time it came into existence, they were part of the nuclear club. So timing is important. Then the third lesson that I draw here is that if you're a smaller power, and if you are not the biggest player in the playground, multilateralism would allow for a more well-balanced and effective governance architecture. Small and middle powers can also assert influence disproportionate to the absolute power in the system through collective bargaining strategies, which was what the NPT experience told us. And number 5, institutions and structural conditions matter. That is why we see excellent compliance and record on non-proliferation and peaceful use of nuclear energy, because you have technical bodies like the IAEA, export control regimes, all of the institutional structures to support non-proliferation and peaceful use of nuclear energy have been established. Whereas to do that for disarmament, we have nothing. So now that we have spoken about all of the lessons that the NPT teaches us, it's time to sort of weave them together with what governance could look like for AI. And the first lesson, that as somebody who comes from India, which I would place as an emerging power in this space, is that China, US, which are the 2 AI superpowers today, their talks are inevitable. They are happening. When I started the research, it still wasn't clear. But as of last month, the first official government talks have already happened. So they're inevitable. They'll be very consequential, because it's actually when these 2 countries agree to sort of limit sovereign controls is when you will actually see that manifest onto the global stage. And it is fraught with risk for India. So the China-US AI race of today, for me, reminds me of the nuclear arms race of the 1950s. And this is a multi-vector competition that's being pursued along different paths. So you have, who's going to have the most cutting-edge innovation, who's going to have the best and most cutting-edge hardware. You're going to put export controls and restrictions on each other. There's an ideological competition, because AI and the potential it holds to sort of influence the information space will also have an effect on this ideological competition that the world is seeing between liberal democratic values and core socialist values. And that's something the Biden administration has also referred to. And to retain the best talent, we're seeing both US and China actively integrate AI applications into military decision-making, ISR operations, nuclear command and decision-making. So these are high-stakes sort of competition. And even though today it may seem like it's directed against each other, so any sort of imagination of what US-China collusion could look like on AI governance seems hard to imagine. But there are really tangible and real things which they could sort of come together, erect guardrails, and put barriers to entry for other smaller players. And today we're seeing these bilateral discussions happen at multiple levels. At the official level, between industry, because this playground is dominated primarily by 3 Chinese and 4 US firms, and abstract dialogues as well. And by the way, these are the 7 companies, Meta, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Baidu, Tencent, and Alibaba, that pretty much dominate the entire AI global ecosystem. So what are the risks? The risk is that the discourse is bilateralized. So you're only going to look at governance from the prism of issues that affect either the interests of China or the US, and as a common minimum sort of starting point for the two countries to come together, which suit both their interests, but could create barriers for others. For example, data flow and monetization norms as a major input into the AI supply chain. For India, having very strong global governance policies on data governance and data monetization, data localization are very important. And these are things that are being opposed by both the US and China. On IP and licensing, for example, on open source models, the environmental compensation, we spoke about the energy cost of maintaining AI systems, and who's going to extract a cost from these companies that are adding further to climate change, even as the developing world is facing immense pressure to, have net zero targets, go on an energy transition, decarbonization spree, whereas you have very sort of mindless AI development without really thinking about the environmental costs. So I think these are some of the areas where it's not hard to imagine that the two countries or the two companies of the two countries could come together and put controls which are not suitable for other countries who don't have such leverages. So for India, the partnership with the US is an extremely important sort of mitigating strategy. Today, we are very closely cooperating on technology under forums like the Quad or the ISET. And I think insisting on transparency, regular consultation and engagement between the India and US on what is the conversation and trajectory of the US-China talks is an important lesson that India needs to keep in mind. Also, identifying some points of alignment with the EU, where the General Data Protection Regulation now finds a lot of alignment with our own data protection bill. So that could also sort of globalize the norms around data governance and data flows. So the lesson 2 that I draw here is that India has a pretty small window of lax regulation where it needs to augment its sovereign capabilities. This is as unregulated as the space is ever going to be. India has certain strengths. It's got a high skill penetration. It is got a dispersed open source architecture, which has sort of formed the basis and the backbone of its digital governance efforts. It's got a great sort of startup ecosystem and a very diffuse digital network with a digital public infrastructure sort of dispersed. Indians are producing large amounts of personal data. The Indian government has, in its AI strategy, proposed something known as the India Dataset Platform, which could eventually actually even become a model for how data monetization and cross-border data flows could take place, allowing developing countries who are producing personal data to extract some sort of a leverage from their resource. But we still have significant vulnerabilities on compute and infrastructure, for which India and government is working through a very targeted public-private partnership approach to build both the sovereign cloud capacity, computing hardware, build in some semiconductor manufacturing like base in India. So this is the window where we need to consolidate capabilities, make it widely available for use, ensure that our data governance normative architecture finds data wider acceptability in the global sphere, talk about how our own concept of data free flow with trust has evolved and nuanced over the past few years, from like an absolute ban on cross-border data flows to now a more sort of letting it go to trusted geographies and having a narrower gap to sort of bridge on data governance. Another issue where we can work with the US is an open source model. I spoke about our strengths in the life cycle on deployment and adaptation. And for that to really translate into any significant strengths for India, we need to work with our partners, especially the US, to ensure that the conversation on open source models, which is, by the way, a debate happening within the US as well. And the White House Ministry of Department of Commerce is expecting to submit a report to the White House listing the advantages and disadvantages. And a lot of studies, even one in Stanford right here, have proved that there is no great risk that open source models have over marginal risk over closed models on any sort of safety, but it does democratize the AI ecosystem. Lesson 3 is for India to center multilateralism. India has followed a very consistent policy of strategic autonomy and multi-alignment. We've diversified our participation across various plurilateral groupings, but UN primacy continues to be key, and we like to do issue-based consolidation because India has a unique vantage. We have different interests for which we need different partners. As democracies and open societies, we'll have interests that coincide with the US and many Western partners, but we're also a developing country. So we also need to situate ourselves within the larger global South. We're a rising power in a hostile neighborhood. So we need to also look at the civilian military sort of dyad a little more, with a little more nuance. So this vantage allows us to synthesize all the regulatory approaches and environments. And with which, my recommendation is that India should use the Summit of the Future, where there is going to be a document called the General Digital Compact, which is going to have global norms around cross-border data flows, data protection and use, data governance, digital public goods and infrastructure. India should circulate white papers and background notes to find interested partners in the UN to push some of our principles into the final architecture. This will also help India to provide an alternative to the US-China binary around the AI ecosystem, because when we talked about the US-China competition, an important part is also embedding their own individual ecosystems across the globe. So you have China's global AI governance initiative, which is linking it to the digital Silk Road. And you already see how it's selling its facial recognition technology to many countries. The US is leading its own sort of block in the NATO, in Quad, in the EU-US transatlantic council. So there are these competitions for embedding their own ecosystems, and India could provide an alternative to this binary. And here I'd like to make a point that not only would India benefit from multilateralism, but honestly, the multilateral system at this point, which is extremely polarized, would also benefit from India. And we've seen an example of this in the G20 presidency, where India was able to drive consensus on a summit declaration. To collectively bargain, leverage collective bargaining power of emerging powers, I've proposed an ideational framework based around the norms of equity, access, and development, which we can use to address specifically the issues of data colonialism and AI vassal states around equity, the environment, around access, the environmental impact and liability to connected with issues of equity, and to use the development paradigm to push AI towards a more socioeconomic prioritization rather than the militaries, to link AI with the attainment of the UN SDG 2030 agenda. And finally, the last lesson is that institutions and structural conditions matter. We saw how without institutions, without enforcement norms, disarmament completely fell apart. So if we have any sort of architecture that comes out on AI governance today, we need to ensure there's a mutual balance of obligations and rights. We need to make sure that these specific organizations which are dealing with these issues, for example, if it's the UNFCCC about climate change, India needs to start already linking AI issues to issues that are being discussed in these forums and ensure that we have a first mover advantage on building the normative architecture around these norms. So I'll stop here. That's about it. Thank you, and look forward to your questions.
All right, everyone. Thank you very much, Mahima. Everyone, we will follow the CSAC protocol of giving the first prerogative of questions to CSAC fellows and students. If you have a brand new question, stick your hand up. If you have a pertinent follow-up to something that is being discussed, the protocol is stick 2 fingers up, and you can jump the queue. Does anyone want to begin? Rhiannon.
Hi, I'm Rhiannon Nielsen. I'm Cybersecurity Postdoctoral Fellow here. Thank you so much, Mahima, for that fascinating talk. It's incredibly comprehensive, and I really appreciate that you mentioned the impacts of AI on climate change and data colonialism. These are incredibly important aspects of the debates that I think are often overlooked. If I can be so indulgent, I have 2 questions. Please feel free to take one or the other. Obviously, there's been the Indian elections overnight. I'm wondering to what extent the outcome of the Indian elections are going to impact India's approaches to artificial intelligence moving forward and engagement within multilateralism more broadly. And then the second question is that I know you've been posted on a diplomatic mission to Moscow previously, and I'm just curious to hear a little bit about to what extent India has engaged with Russia on AI policies as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Rhiannon. I think on the first question about the impact on the elections, I mean, I think we're not expecting any sort of major changes to sort of the government at this point. And even if there were to be any changes, I think foreign policy is an issue on which both parties, India has sort of a bipartisan approach. There's been great consistency. And I think when it comes to something like AI and technology, I don't expect any sort of deviation from the approach that we've had. On the second question about Indian engagement with Russia on AI, to be honest, I'm not really aware if there are any bilateral discussions going on, but I do know that India is engaged on AI sort of policy discussions within the BRICS, for example. So that's a forum where I know that we would be looking at it with Russia, perhaps also in the SCO. But I think at this point, it's not more than sort of exchanging information about respective ecosystems.
Okay. Caleb?
Thanks so much, Mahima. Really important project. I'm Caleb Pomeroy, Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow here at CSAC. You spoke about the similarities between nuclear weapons and AI. Could you speak more about some of the differences between the two and how that might complicate what you're talking about? For example, I know Hannah and Dan Zimmer have written in the bulletin on this topic, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks, Caleb, and that allows me to actually talk about this, which I didn't do in my presentation for lack of time. But yeah, there are very important, crucial differences between the two technologies as well. For example, nuclear technology was primarily state-led. All of the R&D, all of the development, it started from a place of military applications, and then at some point with Eisenhower, in fact, at his Atoms of Peace, it was reimagined as potentially having useful, peaceful applications as well. Whereas in AI, I think you see right just the opposite. It's a private sector-led technology. Governments are awakening to it, as I said, in the second wave of AI. And the controls, the understanding is very much firmly situated within the private sector. Its initial developments have been in the commercial and civilian space, but we now see a move towards larger military applications as well. So these are some of the differences. I think the nature of technology and inputs as well. Nuclear technology can be controlled physically, whereas I think with AI, you will find it harder to control because the raw materials and inputs are fairly virtual in nature. So I think these are important differences. That's why, you know, it's not really practical to just copy paste a lesson from NPT and put it onto AI. And that's why I think examining the AI landscape in these three departments, which I said, governance, supply chains, life cycle, helped me sort of weave those lessons and apply them to AI.
Thank you. We've got Harold at the back.
Sorry, but the two-finger.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, I missed that. Sorry, go ahead.
Ellie, I'm a sophomore. I had.
Wait for the mic.
Okay.
And thanks, Ellie. And everyone, please, I was remiss of me not to mention, please introduce yourselves as you have been doing already.
I'm Ellie. I'm a sophomore. I have another question about the potential differences between NPT and any potential AI regime, in particular in terms of enforcement, because the NPT relied pretty heavily on agencies like the IAEA that were able to go in and physically determine whether a country had capabilities like nuclear weapons. And I'm finding it hard to think of a similar kind of enforcement regime that would be possible with AI, given that it doesn't require such large infrastructure. Can you think of any potential enforcement that would be possible for this, or do you think that's just a structural difference?
No, absolutely. I could think of some institutions and structures which could enforce certain things. For example, I'll speak once again about the environmental cost. So if you have an institution in the UNFCCC, which is actually monitoring and tracking energy consumption, what is an AI system being developed and deployed for? How much energy is being consumed? And then you have sort of a compensation or a cess that you impose on these institutions. I think that's one way to manage, you know, the control. So this will have to be imagined depending on the issue at hand. So when I talk about data governance as being very prime to India's approach to, you know, regulation, there will be a corresponding body. You could have the WTO, for example, which is already discussing trade issues around digital services and digital, digital data trade. So there are particular bodies that will be used to have enforcement and compliance mechanisms for each aspect of regulation that we spoke about. And that is where my last lesson about institution structures sort of is important, because we need to identify what those points are and then parallelly go and track them in each of these organizations that are working on them.
Great. Harold Chinkunas, Deputy Director here at CSAC. Mahima, this is a great talk, very comprehensive and interesting. And I want to go back to the beginning of your talk where you framed this around the issue of digital sovereignty, which is a language we've heard before from the debates over global internet governance. And I'm thinking back to the debates in sort of 2013, 2014, 2015, where global internet governance was in transition. Countries like Brazil and India actually changed their minds. They originally had been quite sovereigntist in their approach. I'm just wondering, is there a similar kind of debate going on in the AI space? Because you're advocating for a multilateral approach, but a multi-stakeholder approach, which is how global internet governance works outside, let's say, China and Russia, has prevailed. So I'd like to sort of just hear a little bit more about that side of the conversation, if it even exists in the AI space. And then I do have a two-finger suggestion on the infrastructure and monitoring issue afterwards.
Thank you, Harold. I think your point about sort of, sorry, could you just repeat the last part of your question?
Oh, no, just let us know, is there an alternative model out there posed? Once existed, sort of the global internet governance just come up. There was a debate between a sort of multilateral approach championed by countries such as Russia and China that, you know, phrased it as digital sovereignty, and a multi-stakeholder approach in which many different actors, including many in the private sector, participated in global internet governance, which was championed by the United States and its partners. And about 10 years ago, that debate sort of ended up on the multi-stakeholder side of the equation. I'm just wondering if there's any kind of debate like that going around the AI governance, or are people pretty firmly thinking that, no, this is going to be more of a multilateral issue, which is handled just between state actors mainly?
No, so thank you so much. Okay, so I think if I'm not wrong, you're talking about some of the conversations, even now within the UN, you have the open-ended working group on cyber governance. And I mean, I'm not sure if that's what you're referring to, but from my understanding on internet governance and all of the sort of debates, it's a contentious issue in the UN. There are two approaches with the general group of experts and the open-ended working group. One is led by the US and its partners, one is Russia, China sort of led, and neither of them are sort of making any headways to getting any closer. But I think internet governance is a very different ballgame altogether, because again, the geopolitical environment where it was developed is completely different. You know, internet came about in the 90s and 2000s, sort of the peak of the liberal international order, which had a lot of cooperation among states. It was not a competitive environment. Today, the environment in which AI is developing and advancing, it sort of lends a very securitized paradigm to the development, especially around military competition. And because you're seeing sort of conflict and churns around the world, it's more of a move somewhat towards multipolarity. There are kinetic conflicts right now in the world after a long time, which has direct involvement of like big powers in the world. So I think this sort of geopolitical environment lends AI a very distinct securitized lens, which is why the concept of sovereign AI here is completely, I would imagine, different from the stakes around sovereign control of the internet. And because of the kind of range of applications that it could be used to work around, and because of this feeling that there are these two camps that are developing, and all countries will either need to become vassals or one or the other, be completely dependent on their technology, ability to use it, to what ends could it be used if, you know, you're either in China camp or in the US camp. I think all of these anxieties is what is sort of driving a more aggressive approach to sovereign AI by countries. And it's happening pretty fast. I mean, we've just about started talking about governance at a global forum in the past year and a half, and you're already like having a very serious approach by countries to focus on building and securing a national capacity to control AI. So that's where I see the differences, but we'll have to see. I mean, eventually, I do think multilaterally getting an agreement at this stage seems quite a distant dream, and that's why I said, you know, multilateralism would also benefit from India, just as India would benefit from multilateralism. But it seems like a sort of a distant dream, and that serves India just fine right now, because we need this period to augment our capabilities.
That's a great answer. So just the two-finger, Arzan, very quickly, and this is actually an idea that actually Cameron Tracy I heard last year in the honors program from one of our undergraduates is the notion that perhaps compute and the infrastructure that supports compute could be the place where you can have the sort of inspection regime similar to the physical infrastructure that the IAEA inspects for nuclear. So just throwing that out there as a possible.
No, you're absolutely right. In fact, I think the current approach in the executive order is actually talking about tracking thresholds and like the highest threshold frontier models above a certain, I don't know, like some petaflop, whatever. That is those are the thresholds under which there are reporting requirements, and you have to do know your customer service norms to the White House and Department of Commerce, and you have to have more stringent inbound screening. So you're right, absolutely. That's a point of control already being seen.
We have Dinsha next.
Thank you. My name's Dinsha. I'm from Hoover at the US-India program over there. I'm just wondering, so it sounds like I like this parallel between thinking about AI and maybe not the nuclear side, but the proliferation side. Right now, India's goal really should be to get as much AI going as it possibly can, whether or not a regime comes into place afterwards. If India's interest is in to be at the bleeding edge of this technology, this is the time to do it. When you think about a foreign agenda for that, it's fair to say that some of the resources are in the country, certainly the talent, right? But when I think about how that talent has to be organized, how it plugs into other places, there should be some thinking about that too, because I see Infosys and TCS setting up their AI shops in the US, not in India. And that could be good if there's some learning going. I see smaller AI companies starting in India, but when they get the chance, they come here very, very quickly, right? And so thinking about how you can develop that indigenous knowledge while also taking the best from other countries, I think that's probably, if I'm putting my Indian foreign policy maker hat on, that's something where I'm really very, thinking very centrally. And there's probably collaboration potential between different countries, especially bilaterally there. Science and technology agreements, getting academics to work together, conferences and stuff like that. I'm just wondering how you think about all of that sort of stuff, because that's part of governance too.
I agree with you, and I think that's exactly what I sort of drive as a lesson as well, that this period we need to be extremely single focused on building capacity and building capability. And I've sort of said in my paper that working with partners like the US, for example, is extremely crucial to not just consolidate on our strengths, talent being one of them. And like you said, talent drain or brain drain to the West is a real concern. And, at this point, we need to be realistic about how we can retain some of that back home, and whether it's worth sort of having these arrangements where somebody's coming here to study for a few years, working here for a few years, and then going back. Like, for example, this is something we're doing under the Quad STEM fellowships that the 4 countries have put together, where the student, like PhDs working on STEM, including AI, are coming to leading US universities, doing some work here for some time, but then they have an obligation to go back and then work in the other 3-4 countries of their own countries. So these kind of arrangements are being discussed. I think forums like the ISET, where you have these different technology verticals and working groups. Workforce and skill development, to my understanding, is an important component of each of these groups. One important vertical of each of these working groups, and what are you addressing? So absolutely working with partners, not just on talent, but also on other things, like we're working with some partners in semiconductors and building some sort of a compute capacity within India, although that's going to take some time. Working on issues like how we have governance around data so that India could benefit from it. These are issues with which we have very major differences and divergences with our close partners in the West, especially the US. There is absolutely no meeting of minds on norms around data localization and cross-border data flow. So these are serious differences that we need to bilaterally iron out, so that this could then prove to be an edifice for global governance. So I agree with that.
Excellent. Let me, there's a couple of people online who have been waiting very patiently, and one of them actually I will identify as a two-finger to this last point that you just made. And this question comes from Akriti Vasudeva Kalyankar at the Stimson Center. And she asks, what are the areas most ripe for US-India cooperation on AI governance? So you spoke about the challenge of potential US-China cooperation. But what are the areas most ripe for US-India cooperation, and to what extent may India's data localization laws be a hindrance to that cooperation?
I'll address the second question first. To what extent would data localization impinge? I think these are issues on which we've sort of been butting heads with the US and other partners in the West for some time now, but our position has evolved. So in 2019, when we had the G20 Osaka summit, India was the only country that refused to sign these guidelines on data free flow with trust, which is basically about free flow of data. And we put our foot down because we connected it to our national security considerations about the ability to control our data and how that is used somewhat to ensure that it is within the borders of the sovereign Indian state. But from that point, I think we've evolved. Our position has evolved. The most recent data protection bill that's been tabled in Parliament, and I think it's already been passed, talks about free cross-border data flows, except for a few restricted geographies where there are security considerations. And we've also seen that like companies have agreed to work with India. So you have a Microsoft, which I think last year has agreed to do some local data centers. We were having a conversation yesterday in another meeting where we were talking about how some of the companies based in other countries like Singapore are paying huge amounts of money to set up local data centers in India so that they could tap into the Indian market. So there are differences, but I think we are seeing a nuanced approach from India. And I would sort of hope that the US and other partners in the West will also see the value of sort of having dispersing leverages across stakeholders rather than keeping it concentrated for its overall ambition of a democratic AI ecosystem. And your first point on the first question on where India and the US could cooperate, I've spoken about areas where there are divergences, but also like on keeping the channels of consultation absolutely open and transparent so that course correction can be done on time. Another big difference for India between the nuclear and AI is also where India is situated vis-a-vis the US and other partners. India was on the, what you can say, completely outside the circle of friends when it came to the nuclear technology, but it's part of allies and partners today, so it stands to benefit us. So those kinds of considerations would obviously, I think, put India in a slightly more favorable position. The fact that we're a democracy, we have an open market, allows us to tap into technologies of the West, not just in the US, but other countries. So that's a big advantage.
Absolutely. There's a couple more online questions. One has, I think, already been addressed on the NPT. Another is a quick, almost a yes or no question. Have you heard of a term that apparently is used a lot in Senate legislation, that instead of AI, it's non-human intelligence, NHI? Have you heard of this? Does this ring a bell?
I haven't, sorry.
And then here's the bigger question. This question comes from Colin Carl, also from CSAC, but dislocated today. And that is an alternative to, again, this issue of US-China collusion on AI might be what you might call a free world club, where the US helps provide access to AI infrastructure to the global South in exchange for safety and security commitments from them, and multilateral export controls outside the club, right? So you're basically building a tent for those who want to join. How do you think India would react to such an arrangement?
I mean, see, on the face of it, sounds perfectly reasonable, but this is exactly what was offered for non-nuclear weapon states in the case of nuclear technology, where we were told that you will be offered, access to peaceful use of nuclear technology, nuclear know-how. We'll teach you how to use it, not just give you the material. And in the end, yes, peaceful use of nuclear energy did happen, but honestly, the goal of keeping the world free from nuclear risk and security, we are far from that today. So I don't know how well sort of such an arrangement could look at it, and it would really specifically determine on what exactly is the infrastructure being offered and on what terms. In climate, we see this a lot. On climate finance and technology, which is supposed to be a commitment of the West to the developing world, we've seen the kind of workarounds that have been done around that to offer them as loans, and not which any country could get on the open market itself. So there's a lot of distrust, I would be very frank, in any of these offers. And I could not comment without seeing specifics, but there are still risks that I would take away as somebody coming from that part of the world.
Even if India was this time around inside that tent?
I think India cannot be inside that tent for reasons I've already mentioned about our position in the supply chain and life cycle. So we are not. If we are, then hope maybe the answer will change, but we're not.
Right. And back to Vatsa, please introduce yourself and welcome back to Stanford.
Thanks. I'm Srivatsa Krishna. I'm a senior civil servant from India and a distinguished senior fellow here. Mahima, terrific talk. Absolutely brilliant. I had 2 comments, and if you have any thoughts around them. I'm part of the United Nations Secretary General's AI advisory panel. Nobody is agreeing on anything. For AI supremacy, you need 3 things. You need data, you need compute, you need people. And China is way ahead of everyone else, US, India, all the other countries put together on that, for the simple reason they have access to citizens' data with impunity, which you don't in the US or in India. Given that, how do you expect China to, it's like asking a bird to cut its own wings. Why would it adhere to any kind of an NPT kind of regime when it's already way ahead in the game? US is nowhere close to China, and US is, of course, way ahead of India. That was the first question. Second, if you saw Trump's interview in the New Time and comments in Europe recently, he explicitly said, we will not protect Europe if Russia decides to attack you, because they have not met their 2% defense target of the NATO commitment. Trump being Trump, he withdrew from the INF last time. He could withdraw from NPT this time. Any thoughts on that? Thanks.
On the first part, yeah, I absolutely agree with you, sir. I mean, these are the 3 critical sort of choke points and energy as well. I mean, I would add to that. But when it comes to China, yes, there's a huge lead vis-a-vis many other countries in the world. All of my assessment, and that could be totally different from what you're seeing in the real world play out in the UN, but at least the literature says that the US still holds a significant lead over China. And even on things like data, where again, China is producing a large amount of data, there have been serious constraints in the quality of Chinese language textual data, which could be used for training and modeling. So already the models that are coming out of China in terms of, are you looking at large language foundation models? Are you looking at adapted models downstream? China doesn't have the cutting edge models coming out as of now from its own ecosystem. And the export control measures that US has now been has in place for the past couple of years, with significant enforcement challenges, if I can add to that, because of commercial interests that the US business community has with China. Despite of that, China is sort of already facing certain constraints on its ability to advance. So I think all of these factors will sort of keep China engaged. But as of now, no country, whether it's the US, China, and definitely India, is seriously interested in putting any controls. I think we are seeing this period like, or you can put it almost as a parallel to the 1950s, where there are some sort of conversations about potential risks and safety that are coming about. Both countries want to control each other's advancements, but at this point, there is not enough motivation to actually put something on paper and lock it up. And that would only happen, like I said in my presentation, when there is a massive diffusion of capability, then the gap between the superpowers and the emerging powers would lessen. And secondly, when there's sort of a, the nuclear case of a mutually assured destruction starts to manifest in some way and threats become apparent. And I think that would determine the timing of when we start to see regulation actually be enforced. Now, on your second question about Trump withdrawing from NPT, I mean, he could. And I think he may. I mean,
the sentence of his interview was, what will you do differently next time around? He said, last time I was too soft.
I have a view on Trump and what that would mean for the world and why that may not be such a bad thing. But anyways, that is a different story. And I think that, yeah, he could withdraw from the NPT. The NPT, in my mind, does need significant work so that it can remain relevant to meeting the challenges it was set out to do. And it's not doing that. We're only seeing sort of a revised nuclear modernization posture from countries around the world. So I think NPT does need a rejig. So perhaps that could be the starting point for that.
One final question from Herb.
Thanks. Great talk, Herb Lin from CSAC and Emerging Technologies kind of person. I'm wondering if you have given any thought to what the analog of an IEA would be for this, and exactly what it would be implementing and so on, or if you know anybody who's done any work on this particular problem. Because I actually think it's it's a nearly insoluble technical problem, and I'd like to be wrong on that.
I mean, to be very honest, it's really hard for me to imagine the specific technicalities of like where the controls would be and what the body would, do. But like Harold mentioned in his remarks, and we spoke a little bit about earlier, where the points of regulation could be. So if that is compute and like what is the threshold of your.
Well, I can think of 100 ways of circumventing that. And so the question is, it gets into some very nitty-gritty technical details, and you need somebody who's going to go through those.
Absolutely.
And I'm wondering if you know anybody who's actually done this.
Not yet, but I think right now we're at the stage where, again, if I'll keep going back to the nuclear example because it's helped guide me like understand this well. So I think right now is the stage where we are establishing that there is a problem. So you can go back to the 1953 speech made by Eisenhower in the UNGA, where he said that there is a problem. We need to change the way we look at nuclear technology as a weapon, sort of instrument for weaponization, to a peaceful. And that is how the IAEA eventually came about. So you first had a very clearly identified problem set, and then somebody worked on the solution. So I think we're at that stage where we're still building towards the conversation of what the final problem could look like. My research is just an attempt from an Indian perspective to see what those points of governance could be. So once we reach that stage, I still think we're a little bit away from that, because how AI applications are actually diffused and deployed is still just a process that's just about starting. But when we get to that stage, I'm pretty sure there will be an imagination of what the structures to control it would look like.
So I'm going to draw it to a close right on time. I think you'll agree. Not only in the Q&A did Mahima's diplomatic training come through a couple of times, but I'm really impressed by this project, not only because it's rigorous, but because it is so topical and will feed so directly into a policy process, which I think is a great standard for what CSAC should be doing. So thank you very much, Mahima. Thank you everyone for attending and engaging.
And thank you, Aizan, for attending.